Hello. This is the second part of a first part video called "The Question of Deconstructing Socialism in One Country." This is a response video to a author of an article entirely. I highly recommend you watch the first part to essentially get the better gist of the entirety of the situation at hand, as well as to better understand kind of like what I'm talking about here and like at least the context of what I would be responding to, and like what this article is entirely about. Unless if you understand the name, where this is talking about socialism in one country, entirely, and my positions on it as a neo-Trotskyist. So like I said, yeah. Highly recommend you watch the first video before watching this one, or not. It's up to you. I don't really care. Anyways, have a good day. Anyways, let's get on to the video. It is theoretically quite possible to grant the existence of a state of society in which there are no classes and the state, but there is an armed people defending the class in its class of society against the external enemies. As a matter of fact, Lenin openly declares that this is exactly what will happen. He proceeds to use a quote from the political program of the Soviet government in March of 1919. As we can see, a complete socialist society is still fully capable of defending itself against external threats. Trotsky seems to have forgotten this definition of the state. He is referring to this quote in the political program of the CPSU made by the Bolsheviks. In the epoch of de-integration of imperialism and growing civil war, it is impossible either to preserve the old army or build up a new one on the so-called non-class or national basis. The Red Army as a weapon of the proletarian dictatorship must, of necessity, bear the openly class character, i.e. it must be made up exclusively of the proletariat and the semi-proletarian strata of peasantry which are akin to it. Only when classes are abolished will this class army be able to be transformed into a socialist militia. The Bolsheviks, political program of the CPSU. Despite what Caelliox says, it is actually unknown to who wrote this, however. It could have been Lenin or not. What we know, though, it was the Bolsheviks, and this was a political program democratically elected by the population of the workers' state at the time. However, Caelliox is misinterpreting this of an actual standing army and not a proletarian militia, of which we pointed out earlier. Believe it or not, this idea was planned and already thought out by Vladimir Lenin all the way back of April of 1917, when the revolution was just a movement of workers. In The Dual Power, Vladimir Lenin says, "What is the class composition of this other government? It consists of the proletariat and the peasants in soldiers' uniforms. What is the political nature of this government? It is a revolutionary dictatorship, i.e. a power directly based on the revolutionary seizure of the direct initiative of the people from below and not on a law enacted by a centralized state power. It is an entirely different kind of power from the one that generally exists in the parliamentary bourgeois democratic republics in the usual type still prevailing in the advanced countries of Europe and America. This circumstance, often overlooked, often not given enough thought, yet it is the clou of the matter. This power is of the same type of the Paris Commune of 1871. The fundamental characteristics of the type 1, the source of power is not a law previously discussed in the act of the parliament, but the direct initiative of the people in their local ideas and the direct seizure of the current expression. 2. The replacement of the police and the army, in which the institutions are divorced and the people set against the people, by the direct arming of the whole people, in order to state in a power of the maintained by the armed workers and peasants themselves, by the armed people themselves. 3. The officialdom of the armed workers and of the bureaucracy are either similarly placed with the direct rule of the people themselves, or at least placed under the special control, or they not only become elected officials, but are also subject to the recall of the people's first demand. They are reduced to the position of the simple agents from a privileged group holding quote-unquote jobs remunerated on a high bourgeois scale. They become workers of a special arm of surveillance of service, whose remuneration does not exceed to the ordinary pay of a competent worker. Vladimir Lenin, The Dual Power. Vladimir Lenin goes on to say in the same document, it should be clear from this why our comrades too make so many mistakes when putting the question simply. Should the provisional government be overthrown immediately? My answer is 1. It should be overthrown, for it's an oligarchic, bourgeois, and not a people's government, and unable to provide the peace bred for or full freedom. 2. It cannot be overthrown just now, for it's being kept in power by a direct and indirect a former and actual agreement with the Soviets of workers' deputies. And primary with the chief Soviet, the Petrograd Soviet. 3. Generally, it can be overthrown in the ordinary way, the rest on the support given to the bourgeoisie by the second government. The Soviet workers' deputies and that government is the only possible revolutionary government which directly expresses the mind and will go to the majority of the workers and peasants. Humanity has not yet evolved to, and we do not as yet know a type of government superior to and better than the Soviet of workers, agricultural laborers, peasants, and soldiers' deputies. To become a power of class-conscious workers must win the majority to their side, as long as no violence is used against the people. There is no other road to power. We are not Blancias. We do not stand into the seizure of power by a minority. We are Marxists. We stand for a proletarian class struggle against petty bourgeois intoxication, against chauvinism, defensism, phrasemongering, and a dependence on the bourgeois. Vladimir Lenin, The Dual Power. It's fair to say that after reading this and understanding this, which is pointed out quite clear, that the commonly referred Red Army is not a standing army. Rather, it is a proletarian militia that has been regulated by the population, made up of the proletariat, and democratically has came into the decisions that had to be made time via vote. Of course, there are points where they had to be centralized when the revolution continued, but common militants still had a lot of say into the things being done. Also, to point out again from the foreword that Leon Trotsky had made for his speech, he was referring to the state, not of a political state, rather the state of situations. The second point Trotsky raises in his speech is that the building of socialism in one country acts as a backstab to the world proletariat, but this is nonsense. Firstly, individual capitalist countries can build complete socialism only in alliance with the international proletariat. Stalin himself says, he proceeds to quote Joseph Stalin, the final victory of socialism in the USSR. He refers to this quote by Joseph Stalin. Leninism teaches the final victory of socialism in the sense of the full guarantee against the restoration of the bourgeois relations is possible only on an international scale. Joseph Stalin on the final victory of socialism in the USSR. The absolute imagination of Caelliox here. How would you be able to establish socialism in one country when the fact is that capitalism is an economic system with a specific social relation is international? Economics entirely is international. Whatever economic structure you have in one country affects the entire world market. Commodity exchange and profit spans onto the global scale and even extracts resources and build those commodities on the international scale. For example, the majority of oil in the United States is traded and exchanged from Saudi Arabia and Iraq to the United States. Majority of companies have production in China and then shipped out into the rest of the world to sell them into the market. It is all international, and all a part of it would need to be is all international and a part of the same relation capitalism has. Thus, to say this can be done in one country is impossible, for it would need to abolish classes. If that could be done in just an individual country, then through the relation of the world market, they can just force those countries to concede and have them produce commodities into the world market and exchange it. This is why This is why there's even a dictatorship of the proletariat as a state apparatus to combat against this and be able to fight the bourgeoisie and have its revolution on the international scale. Karl Marx makes this very clear. Well, we suppose then in a 1/4 of wheat and 1 ounce of gold are equal values or equivalents because they are crystallizations of equal amounts of average labor. Of so many days or so many weeks, labor respectively fixed in them, and thus determining the relative values of the gold and corn. Do we refer to any way whatever to the wages of the agricultural laborer and the miner? Not a bit. We leave in the quite indeterminate how their days on their weeks labors was paid, and even whether wage labor was employed at all. If it was wages, may have been very unequal. The laborer whose labor is realized in the 1/4 of wheat may receive 2 bushels only to the laborer employed in mining may receive 1/2 of the ounce of gold. Or supposing their wages to be equal, they may deviate in all possible proportions from the values of the commodities produced by them. They may amount to 1/4, 1/5, or any other proportional part of 1/4 of corn and 1 ounce of gold. Their wages can, of course, not be more than the values of the commodities they produce, but they can be less in every possible degree. Their wages will be limited. The values of the products, but the values of their products will not be limited by the wages. And above all, the relative values of corn and gold, for example, will have to be settled without any regard whatsoever the value of the labor employed. That is to say, to wages to determine the values of the commodities and the relative quantities of labor fixed in them, and therefore a quite different and teleological method of determining the values of commodities and the value of labor, or by wages. This point, however, will be further elucidated in the progress of our inquiry. Karl Marx, Value, Price, and Profit. Karl Marx continues. The value of a commodity is determined by the total quantity of labor contained in it, but part of the quantity of labor is realized in the value of which is equivalent has been paid in the form of wages, part of the realization in a value for which no equivalent has been paid. Part of the labor contained in the commodity is paid labor. Part is unpaid labor. By selling, therefore, the commodity at its value, that is the crystallization of the total quantity of labor bestowed upon it, the capitalist must necessarily sell it in a profit. He sells not only what has cost him an equivalent, but he sells also to what cost him nothing, although it has cost the workman labor. The cost of the commodity to the capitalist and its real costs are different things. I repeat, therefore, that normal and average profits are made by selling commodities, not above, but their real values. Karl Marx, Value, Price, and Profit. This is something that Karl Marx recognized and analyzed and saw in capitalism. This exploitation and profit accumulation and propagation of profit is done by the international scale, all under the same system. Thus, for us as communists and for us to get to our goals, we have to look at this as an internationalist and see that there are no borders when it comes to capitalism as an economic structure. Thus, the revolution has to be permanent and international and never stops until capitalism is defeated and until all power is handed to the workers as a class, to abolish classes and money. For Karl Marx himself, to put in more detail, but these demands can in no way satisfy the party of the proletariat. While the democratic petty bourgeois want to bring the revolution to an end as quickly as possible, achieving at most the aims already mentioned, it is our interest and our task to make the revolution permanent until all the more less property classes have been driven from their ruling positions, until the proletariat has conquered state power, and until the association of proletarians has progressed significantly far, not only in one country, but in all the leading countries of the world. That competition between the proletarians of these countries ceases, at least the decisive forces of production are concentrated into the hands of the workers. Our concern cannot be simply to modify private property, but to abolish it. Not to hush up class antagonisms, but to abolish classes. Not to improve the existing society, but to find a new one. Karl Marx, Address to the Central Committee to the Communist League. It is clear here that though the research he has taken into capitalism and the material conditions that in a lot of cases are still in effect to this day, the fact is the revolution has to be done on international and for us to get anywhere. And to see socialism, which again we covered, is too moneyless, classless, and thus stateless. As well as the fact that capitalism as an international social relation, we have to see this and we have to know for a fact that socialism and capitalism can't be looked at nationally and cannot coexist within each other. We have to look at things in its totality. We always have to look things in general in its totality. Always. The question is not whenever we should have an alliance with the international proletariat, because the clear answer is yes, we should. The question is now put somewhat differently. How should this alliance be handled? When the proletarians of the USSR seized power in October 1917, this was an assistance of the proletarians of all countries in the alliance with them. When the proletarians of Germany made a revolution in 1918, this was assistance of the proletarians of all countries, especially the proletarians of the USSR. It was an alliance with the proletariat of the USSR when the proletarians of the Western Europe, frustrated in the intervention against the USSR, refused to transport arms to the counter-revolutionary generals, set up councils of action, and undermine the rear of their the capitals. This was the assistance of the proletarians of the USSR. This was an alliance of the West European proletarians with the proletariat of the USSR. Without this sympathy and this support, the proletarians of the capitalist countries, the Bolsheviks, could not have won the Civil War. Yes, the revolution in Russia was able to be helped by comrades all around the world, but many other revolutions were happening during this time in Europe, North America, South America, and Asia. Workers were uprising after the Russian Revolution and were creating their own movements. However, these revolutions failed to organize, failed to supply, failed to even get a worker state, failed to organize proletarian militias, failed to keep the interests of the proletariat, and just so much more problems within the revolutions from 1917 to 1923. And overall, just the communist movements that was happening during this time entirely. Because most were following anarchism, syndicalism, and Blanquism, as well as many fronts of Marxism that has misconceptions such as Leninism, counter-communism, and left communism. All having different methods of organizing, then did not see the actual formations of a successful international revolution, which of course, seeing this, Lenin wrote possibly one of the best books he had ever written, in my opinion, called, quote-unquote, Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder. In Germany, for example, like you said, in 1919, the Spartacus League had advocated for councils made up of workers, and proceeded to do as so. The Berlin Workers' Council was established, and it would be split into districts of Berlin, seeing that Bavaria would take the Leninist method, yet fall due to the refusal of the abolition of the standing army and police force back to Berlin. However, with these councils being decentralized and not under the control of any party, these councils lack supplies, methods, and know-hows for the revolution to get going. Thus, they eventually had to be centralized under the Spartacus League, like they should have done in the first place. The problem is the Spartacus League didn't see this coming and failed at planning for this. Because they thought that the workers' councils can be able to supply themselves and be able to create methods for themselves. So prior to it, they let the Social Democrats of Germany into the league. I think a lot of people know where this is going, to form their own faction. So the communists took to the streets and started protesting and arming themselves and taking the city districts. Once this happened, the Social Democrats they allowed in told a fascist militia known as the Freikorps. They found them in the apartment. There, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht was brutally executed. With their leaders dead and more organizing of the police and fascist death squads now being backed by the Social Democrats that betrayed them, the revolution ended at a capitalist victory. More or less, the same fate would happen in Western Europe as well. Red Week in Netherlands and Belgium failed at getting anything done, and again, a lack of planning and supplies. It had to left Panana Cook having to flee the entirety of the country. Alsace-Lorraine had done the same thing, and the Social Democrats in France quickly went to secure the territory and claim it to be a part of the Third Republic of France. In Italy, you had actually an attempt of a vanguard, but it was relatively compared to the compared to the Bolsheviks, it was very much bureaucratic. In comparison, the Italians, not the Russians, and just saw the intellectuals lead the revolution, rather see the workers themselves organizing the party to get involved. This was then crushed by Mussolini's fascist militia called the Black Shirts. In Hungary, Bavaria, Slovakia, and Finland, it would be different. Here they actually adopt the Leninist method and Leninist analysis on Marxism and what it actually means. However, they either didn't have the materials to do so, failed to abolish the army and police force, and promoted nationalist messaging as of a last attempt. Let's start with Bavaria. They had established a worker state through the means of the Party of the Proletariat, but they had still let the police force and standing army remain in the act and justice of defense, which did not give democratic structures to actually empower the proletariat, and as well have these police and armies to then work with the capitalists when they secured the rest of Germany. In Hungary and Slovakia, they were possibly the most successful ones, but then they started trying to appeal to the nationalists and try to get them on their side when they were fighting against the Romanian armies, trying to crush them, which led them to promote nationalist statements, and so the nationalists can join, only to win, but then get backstabbed at the end, and for Hungary to fall to a nationalist government. In Slovakia, they were invaded by the nationalists that had destroyed the worker state in Hungary. In Finland, well, they simply couldn't handle the winter and didn't have better clothing with foreign support to the capitalists. And with the foreign support to the capitalists in Finland, the Socialist Workers' Republic of Finland fell. The point is to show that although we did get support at the end, it was just Russia. Even though the revolutions didn't happen in just Europe, there were socialists in all the continents except Antarctica. Honestly, the revolutions of 1917 and 1923 deserve their own video and just shows the importance of the working class. But either way, in the end, Russia and Mongolia were on their own. And they really couldn't do anything because they needed the proletariat to be able to organize prior and already have worker states. All they could do now without oppressing the workers and still be a worker state was to organize an international party of the proletariat by which they can plan and discuss for the next wave of revolution. And now be there to make right moves. This didn't happen, however, for Vladimir Lenin died and there was a bureaucratic takeover of the elections of 1925 that appointed the leadership without the consideration of the population's vote into the government. Thus we saw the degeneration of the worker state only to continue until there was no escape but capitalism. When the proletarians of other countries see the successes of their own countries at building socialism, a new society freed from exploitation, they'll see it and share it with the world, showing that another way is possible. When the proletarians of one country reconcile their dictatorship, put an end to the economic disruption, develop constructive work, and achieve successes in the building of socialism, this is support and the highest value for the proletarians of all countries for the struggle against capitalism. Their struggle for power because of the existence of the Socialist Republic and faithfulness. Its successes on the front of socialist construction are factors of the highest value of the world revolution, factors that encourage the proletarians of all countries in their struggle against capitalism. Caelliox, what is up with your imagination and trying to compare it to history? Did you not look into the history of the revolutions of 1917 to 1923? Although very significant and very important for us as communists to support because it shows the fact that socialism is possible, but at the end of the day, Russia was on their own. And they couldn't do much when they were still trying to stabilize their economy through the means of the workers' state. Where revolutions and their organizing had already been reduced to the legacy and news on how the revolutions were crushed. Without the rest of the other revolutions happening around Europe or Western Asia, and only having small movements left in the United States and Brazil, all they could do was try and formulate an international vanguard made up of the proletariat to form more proletarian organizations for the proletariat to plan, discuss, and democratically come to the formation of how they were going to hit hard against the bourgeoisie. Without Germany, England, France, Finland, Hungary, Italy, and various other countries, they were basically surrounded. Then the socialist revolutionary movements in the United States and Brazil were also crushed. Now all they had was Mongolia as an ally. To back up which I quoted Lenin, which I'll quote Lenin. And so, in our case now, we are far from having completed even the transitional period from capitalism to socialism. We have never cherished the hope that we could finish it. Without the aid of the international proletariat, we had never any illusions on that score, and we know how difficult the road that leads from capitalism to socialism. But it is our duty to say that our Soviet Republic is a socialist republic because we have taken this road, and our words will not be empty words. Vladimir Lenin, Third All-Russia Congress of the Soviets of Workers, Soldiers, and Peasants Deputies. They did all they could, but they can only do so much. They tried so hard for them to get to where they are, and even tried to help them. But it ended in defeat and betrayal. All they could do now was use the resources they had to build up the working class again. But then they themselves would be betrayed within the worker state by a faction with bureaucratic tendencies. Vladimir Lenin made this very clear in his declarations to have an international revolution and have this revolution to be formulated in all corners of the globe, or at least in all the leading countries, so it may naturally progress. This is a long quote, so bear with me here. We know perfectly well, of course, that the international bourgeoisie as the present much stronger than our republic, and that is only the particular combination of the circumstances that is preventing it from continuing the war against us. For several weeks now, we have witnessed fresh attempts of the Far East to renew the invasion, and there is not slightest doubt that the similar attempts will continue. Our party has no doubts whatsoever on that score. The important thing for us is to establish an unstable equilibrium exist, and we must take the advantage of the respite, taking into the consideration of all characteristic features onto the present situation, adapting our tactics to the specific features of this situation, and never forgetting that the necessity for an armed struggle arises quite suddenly. Our task will to organize and build up the proletarian militia in connection with the food problem. Two, we must continue to think first of all of our Red Army, and we cannot adopt no other in the line of the present international situation. We must still be prepared for the fresh attacks of the fresh attempts at invasion on the part of the international bourgeoisie. In regard of our practical policy, however, the fact is that a certain equilibrium has been reached, and the international situation has a significance, but only in the sense we have admitted although the revolutionary movement has made progress, the development of the international revolution this year has not proceeded along with the straight line as we had expected. When we started the international revolution, we did so not because we convinced that we could forestall the development, but because of a number of circumstances compelled us to start it. We thought either the international revolution comes to our assistance, and in that case our victory will be fully assured, or we shall do our modest revolutionary work to the conviction that even the event of defeat we shall have served in the cause of the revolution, and treat our experience will benefit other revolutions. It was clear to us that without the support of the international world revolution, the victory of the proletarian revolution was impossible. Before the revolution, even after it, we thought either revolution breaks out in the other countries, in capitalistically more developed countries immediately, or at least very quickly, or we must perish. In spite of the conviction, we did all possibly could to preserve the Soviet system under all circumstances, come what may, because we knew that we were not only working for ourselves, but also the international revolution. We knew this. We repeatedly expressed this conviction before the October Revolution, immediately after it. And at the time we signed the Brest-Litovsk Peace Treaty. And generally speaking, this was correct. Vladimir Lenin, Third Congress of the Communist International. Couldn't have said it better myself, Vladimir Lenin. The only way you can say this was the case if you just jump forward in time to talk about the involvement of the Soviet Union into the Second Imperialist War, which in all regards, it was not by any means a workers' revolution. By 1932, the Soviet Union had used private property, and they were to reinstitute in order workers to work in those lands, which they would produce goods and resources and then start selling them into the world market in 1932 and then get profit from what they sold. Then having to make the calculations to pay the workers wages into the country, thus acting as a means of an institution owning others' means of production and getting profit from it, which they cut the amount of labor time performed into the workday to pay the worker the wage, so they can keep production going and pay for materials. Especially since the fact that this land by 1932 was not under the control of the state. It was leased and handed out to bureaucrats and officials who now owned production. They exchanged this almost all over the world, especially in Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Turkey, Spain, and Romania. When the Germans offered to have both of them invade Poland, they did so because it was profitable and they could gain factories, resources, and most importantly, capital from the invasion, alongside with the German armies into the west. They invaded from the east and basically took eastern Poland with 140 casualties out of the 700,000 that had invaded for the Polish armies had moved their troops in the west to fight the Germans, not seeing the Russian invasion. This by far is an example for state capitalism. I plan on making more arguments and making a separate video about state capitalism and what that means and why the USSR was that. But this, as I provided, is one of the main points of why the USSR was state capitalist and degenerated even further. Now, let's enter World War II into the equation completely. Fast forward, more purging of the old Bolsheviks, the assassination of Leon Trotsky, the Third International with a failed infiltration into the Fourth International, and the formation of the International Communist Current. All right, the Soviet Union was invaded by the Nazis, and their exchange with the United States and the United Kingdom was about to pay off because they got more support from capitalist nations against another capitalist nation, which they themselves, as we demonstrated, had generalized commodity production and facilitated the same social relation as capitalism. Fast forward again, Nazi Germany gets help from Finland, they try to take the Caucasus, Stalingrad happened, and now the tides have turned for Germany. So the Soviet Union marched further west and had reached to Berlin after fighting a really hard battle. Berlin fell and the Nazi regime was officially destroyed. Before the Battle of Berlin, though, there was already an agreement of territory and the spheres of influence the people would have in all of Europe. This is where Caelliox can only objectively say that there would have been a secure revolution in Europe. But here's some problems with that logic. One, by this time the Soviet Union had already facilitated the same social relation of capitalism as every other country, and the only difference is the state acted as an abstract class, and there was a planned economy that helped plan distributions to the bureaucrats' favor. 2, they had allied with the Nazis in Berlin before they got involved, in the meaning that they weren't supporting any workers' side. They were supporting for both sides of the bourgeois states. 3, they had allied with the bourgeoisie and had gotten into the war to gain capital. 4, the supposed socialist states that had been established weren't established by workers' revolution, rather through war. All of these are problems with the entire method and theory for us communists. We have already covered 1, but let's go with 2, 3, and 4. The second problem is the fact that they were essentially on the sideline most of the time, exchanging commodities and profiting by selling goods to both the British and the Germans. Which they did so by the means of course, having workers sell their labor power and produce commodities for a certain amount of time that they can't control, thus having them own workers' production and having them get profit from their work. Especially since this wasn't even the state. It was especially bureaucrats and officials that had land leased from banks and investors to make them bourgeois. And even then, it wasn't. If this wasn't the case, remember the state can act as an abstract class and be able to own the population's production. This is even pointed out by Friedrich Engels in Anti-Capitalism. A third division of labor was added by civilization to create a class that did not take part in the production but occupied itself merely of the exchange of products. The merchants, all former of the attempts at class formation, were exclusively concerned with production. They divided with the producers and the directors and directed into producers on a more or less extensive scale. But here a class appears in the first time that captures the control of production in general and subjugates the producers to its rule without taking at least part in production. A class that makes itself indispensable to the mediator between the two producers and exploit them both under the pretext of saving them into the trouble and risk of exchange, of extending the markets of their products and distant regions, and thus becoming the most useful class in society, a class of parasites, genuine social homogenes, that skim the cream of production at home and abroad, as a new reward for very insignificant services that rapidly amass an enormous wealth and gain social significance accordingly, that for this reason reap ever new honors and the ever greater control of the production during the period of civilization, until at last being the light of a product of their own periodical crises in industry. Friedrich Engels in Anti-Capitalism. The third problem is quite obvious. Instead of organizing workers in their countries and forming socialist parties and getting the workers educated to fight into the socialist parties by which they can control, as of a mass organization of the proletariat, in other words, the vanguard, they chose to join with capitalists and only then fight against another capitalist power with petty bourgeois interests. Thus, instead of taking an anti-imperialist and power to the workers themselves stance, the Soviet Union participated into the war themselves in order to gain capital, instead of taking an anti-imperialist stance like what Vladimir Lenin did when it came to the context of the First World War. We helped the workers, not the bourgeoisie, period. But picture to yourselves a slave owner who owned 100 slaves warring against a slave owner who owned 200 slaves for a more just distribution of slaves. Clearly, the application of the term defensive war or war for the defense of the fatherland in such a case would be historically false, and in practice would be a sheer deception of the common people and facilities of ignorant people, of the astute of the slave owners. Precisely in this way are the present-day imperialist bourgeoisie decising the peoples by the means of national ideology and the term defensive of the fatherland in the present war between the slave owners and fortifying the strengthening slave army. Vladimir Lenin, Socialism and War. The fourth problem is very bureaucratic and is very substitutionist, as well as that it limits the actual freedoms for workers in the first place. Instead of having it so they can start the formations to create a new society, rather than trying to imitate the current one, they claim to want to destroy. It is not our job as communists to make decisions over the proletariat and try to be the stone to be over them. It is up to the workers themselves and for them to have their revolution against the bourgeoisie that oppressed them in the first place. Without this, there can be no workers' state, only a state that claims to be in the interest of the workers, but in practice is not. We are not Blanquists. We are Marxists. The role for the liberation of the working class and establishment of a worker state has to do with the workers have a revolution once they are educated by the communists and establish their own state in which they can abolish the foundations of a traditional state and soon abolish society as a whole in order to create a new one. This is a worker state and is under the control of the proletariat themselves. It is not a state in a traditional sense, rather it is a revolutionary one that desires to abolish itself and all states entirely, which they do so by the means of their own democratic structures under the rule of the majority, which they can control. This can't be done if we just invade countries and decide over the proletariat through the means of not empowering them. This is exactly why Karl Marx had problems with Louis Blanqui, and it has the opposite effect and practice in the ends that we want to achieve through our means to get to the ends. While this utopian doctrine, socialism, which subordinates the total movement to one of its stages, which puts in place of the common social production the framework of individual dependence, and above all in fantasy does away of the revolutionary struggle of classes and its requirements for the small gongers and tricks of the sentimentally, while this doctrine socialism, which at bottom only idealizes the present society and takes picture without the shadows, and wants to achieve its ideal authort, a realities of present society, while the proletariat surrenders this socialism to the petty bourgeoisie, while the struggle of the different socialist leaders among themselves sets forth the each and so-called systems of the pretentious adherence to one of the transit points of the social revolution against another. The proletariat rallies more and more around revolutionary socialism and around communism, for which the bourgeoisie had itself invented the name of Blanqui. This socialism is a declaration of the permanence of the revolution, the class dictatorship of the proletariat, and necessary transit to the point of the abolition of class distinctions generally, to the abolition of all relations of production, which they rested the abolition of the social relations corresponding to the relations of production, to revolutionizing of all the ideas and result of these social relations. Karl Marx, The Class Struggles in France. Very wise words from Marx. It's not our job to make worker states. The worker states are made up of the working class, and they are instituted by the means of revolution, not making a puppet state of formerly occupied territory, from a treaty to decide the fate of an imperialist war. Such are forms of alliance between the proletariat of one country and the international proletariat. I want to quote again, on the slogan for the United States of Europe by Lenin. He proceeds to quote the previous quote that had been quoted from Vladimir Lenin. Pay attention to the last part. Is this not exactly what the USSR did? Organize socialist production and rise against the rest of the world? The capitalist world? I think we can safely say that it was. No, it fucking wasn't. We just demonstrated why it wasn't. Is this not the single country that can do the international proletariat in the struggle against capital? He refers to this quote by Vladimir Lenin. Uneven and economic political development is an absolute law of capitalism, hence the victory of socialism is possible in several or even one capitalist country alone. After expropriating the capitalists and organizing their own socialist production, the victorious proletariat of that country will rise against the rest of the world, the capitalist world. Vladimir Lenin on the slogan of the United States of Europe. We already demonstrated the context of this quote and like why this quote is fucking illegitimate. But so yeah. As I said before, this entire document refers to socialism as of a tendency, not of its economic structure. As for your answer to your question, no, that isn't what they did at all, because they couldn't. And the only way that you can constitute they did it is if the puppet states had workers' revolution, which they didn't. And at the same time, claim that the USSR was still a worker state by 1932, which they weren't. Before we move to the question of degeneration, I feel it's important to first talk about the new economic policy and the theory of permanent revolution. Firstly, I feel it's important that we address the new economic policy, as I've seen Trotskyists wrongly proclaim Lenin wanted Russia to hold on to the new economic policy until the proletarian revolution is successful in Europe. But this view is divorced from reality. Firstly, what is the economic policy? I've never heard any Trotskyists say this ever. In fact, when I talk with my Trotskyist comrades, they agree that the new economic policy was an acceleration of the support for the economic structure for a revolutionary workers' state, as well as the fact the policy itself was to refer the situation at hand to the material conditions they had at the time. If any Trotskyists actually said this, which I highly doubt, then I please assure you to read chapter 22 of the first 5 years. The first 5 years of the Communist International, where he says, "Let us analyze this question, taking the railways in this case in point, and precisely railway transportation that provides the field in which is prepared for the maximum degree of the workers' economy, because of the railway network in our country has been for the most part nationalized already under capitalism, and it has been centralized to a certain extent normalized and at the very conditions of technology. The bigger half of the roads obtained from the state, the remainder we can confiscate from the private companies. A genuine social management must, of course, approach the entire network as a unit. That is, not from the standpoint of an owner of this or railway line, but from the standpoint of the interest of the entire transport workers system and the country's economy as a whole. It must apportion locomites of the freight cars among the various lines and the meet requirements of the economic life as a whole. But a transition to such an economy, even the centralized field railway transport, is not so simple. A whole number of intermediate economic and technical stages is involved. The locomotives happened into the various types because they were constructed into different periods by different companies and by different plants, and furthermore different types of locomotives are simultaneously repaired into the same set railway shops, and conversely locomotives under the same pipe of the different shops. Capitalist society wastes, as a well known, a huge amount of labor power. It is the super division of the anarchistic kinetoscope of the component parts of the productive apparatus. It is consequently necessarily to the locomotives according type of the allot them to the various railway shops. This is the first serious step to the road toward dismantling. That is the institution of the technological homogeny and the recorded locomotives of the locomotive parts of the dismantling. As we have said more once, and correctly so, the workers can control in technology. Failing normalization, technology can reach the fullest flowering. And where we stand at the private production in our country, we did actually tackle this, and the task immediately ran up to the major obstacles of the railway lines, not only into privately owned but also state-owned lines settled into their accounts with all the economic enterprises through the medium of workers' planned economy established under the particular system of the economically unavoidable necessary because of the equivalent of development of a particular line upon however it justifies itself economically. Whether the particular railway is beneficial to the economy and can be asserted only through the medium of planned distribution, so long as we have not elaborated on the methods of overall statistical calculations, a worker's economy, and these methods, as I said, can become available only as the result of the extensive practical experience and gain of the basis of workers' control and the means of production and the formations of the state. Leon Trotsky, First 5 Years of the Communist International, Volume 2. Leon Trotsky, as a Soviet representative, makes it clear here on the economics of the NEP. Lenin explains that he proceeds to quote Vladimir Lenin in the New Economic Policy and the Tasks of the Political Education Department, a report of the second all Education Department's report to the Second All-Russia Congress of the Political Education Departments, and to Lenin, the NEP meant he proceeds to quote the section from the same book. Caelliox refers to these quotes from Vladimir Lenin in the New Economic Policy and the Tasks of the Political Education Departments to the Second All-Russia Congress Political Education Departments by Vladimir Lenin. Jesus Christ, that's a fucking mouthful. During the revolution in our time, we assumed that we could proceed to the straight to socialism without the primary period of the old economy, which adapted to the socialist economy. 3 years later, experience had proven that it was not possible in our conditions today, with the revolutions around us ending with no victory of the workers and in their respected areas. Vladimir Lenin, the New Economic Policy and the Tasks of the Political Economy and the Tasks of the Political Education Departments. Oh my god, that is a mouthful. Jesus Christ. The NEP meant the change in strategy based on the clear recognition of this defeat instead of the immediate transition to socialist economy. There would have been a fairly long transitional period. Vladimir Lenin, the New Economic Policy and the Tasks of the Political Economy and the Tasks of the Political Education Departments. I just want to say again that under this time, the NEP to Lenin and the entire politics and economics of the USSR at the time is to mean that the rest of the world were crushed and was left as movements in America and Argentina, which they eventually were defeated as well. In practice, the measures adopted by the New Economic Policy in 1921 were the following. We're going to tackle this very much misinterpreted idea of the New Economic Policy of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics one by one. Keep in mind, each of what I would be responding to this is just going to be structured one by one talking points and not its totality to make it easier to have a response. Anyways, let's get started. Restoration of commercial relations between town and countryside. The wartime emergency system of military requisitioning the grain from the peasants had stopped. In its place, Lenin proposed the Soviet power adopted tax in kind. The peasantry would no longer have to give up the entire grain surplus to the state, but only a fixed known percentage of it, whereas thus the material insensitive to increase food production. The peasant would be left with a portion of the grain surplus and exchange on the regular market basis for products of industry. This is very much wrong under the idea that there was a market basis of industry. By 1918, the market had been fully abolished, even under the NEP. Even under the NEP, it was not instituted. It was replaced with a workers' planned economy under the control of the working class based on utility production, and would have people produce for themselves and others as well. Then they could keep what they produce and get distribution on a certain time for them to get taken care of. It would focus on the production of a cooperative and the team, where people will input certain skills of development of the production and get an output of what they produce and help out distribution and plan it based on the use for themselves and others, which can be distributed to the rest of the population and for themselves. This is actually hated by the peasantry and was one of the last reasons of why the peasant sailors in Kronstadt rebelled against the regime, because they considered the same form of production under the Tsarist regime. The truth is, they made conditions impossible for people to get profit, which was antagonistic to the peasantry in reality, and actually led to the rebellions against the Soviet regime trying to make market distribution. Kronstadt actually being one of them, technically. If this was true, most likely Kronstadt and Tarkov rebellions wouldn't have happened at any turn. Then it wouldn't be a worker state. The truth is, if what he was saying was true, then the Council Communists, Marxist Humanists would be right in their criticism of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, but not through the reasons they give, but completely different ones that did not happen in this really weird idea Caelliox is trying to paint here. 11. To grant the peasant full right to what he sees fit, and his land and also the process of cattle. which he must maintain and manage with his own strength, but with profitable compensation. 12. To ask all military units and their comrades in the military cadres to associate themselves with their resolutions. 13. We demand that all resolutions be widely published in the press. 14. To appoint the traveling bureau for control. 15. To permit free artisan production and individual labor. The Kronstadt insurgents, demands and resolutions. I really want you to focus more on 11, 12, and 15. If Caelliox was telling the truth, then there would be no point in calling these demands. Could it be that what Caelliox is saying is not statistically correct? Well, yeah. Restoration of retail trade. The Soviet power retained the state monopoly of grain trade in the wholesale level, and kept control of the wholesale trade in the most products of the large-scale industry operating on the nationwide scale. But private retail trade and limited wholesale trade in the regional and local sale were again legalized. Private merchants were encouraged to operate. This is slightly true, but not under the context that the author, Caelliox, is painting here. Retail trade and grain trade had been reestablished, but they were under the control of the workers, and they were used for management instead of just regular circulation for a consumer to a seller, or vice versa. This retail trade was under the control and say of Soviets, not the Soviet state. Again, production was under the control of the workers and had abolished the market for the means of starting utility production and try to formulate a workers' economic structure that has the desire to establish socialism and abolish classes as a whole. Any conditions for a monopoly and for people to get profit was very much negated through the abolition of private production, commodity production, markets, regular circulation of money, bourgeois control of the means of production, profit motives, and profit gainment of self-ownership. While doing this, implemented the workers' public production, utility production, a centralized workers-controlled planned economy, management circulation, proletarian control of the means of production, material motives, the gainment and the use of products rather than exchange, and gainment of the use of products rather than exchange. To even quote Lenin on this topic, the proletarian state may, without changing its nature, permit freedom to trade and the development of capitalism only within certain bounds, and only in the condition of the state regulates, supervises, controls, and determines the forms and methods, etc. Private trade and private capitalism would be abolished. The success of such regulation will depend on only on the state authorities, but also on the larger extent by the workers, and the degree of the maturity of the proletariat, of the masses, of the working people, generally onto the cultural level, etc. But even if this regulation was completely successful, the antagonism of the class interest between labor and capital will certainly remain. Consequently, on the one main task in the henceforth to confront of the trade unions and to protect in every way the class interest of the proletariat in its struggle against capital. This task should be openly put into the forefront of the machinery of the trade unions, and such reorganized, changed, and supplemented accordingly. Conflict commissions, strike funds, mutual aid funds, etc. Should be formed rather than built up. Vladimir Lenin. Role and functions of the trade unions under the new economic policy. You don't have to take Vladimir Lenin's word for it either. You can look at the economy. You can clearly see that they were not relying on exchange, and they were producing products and distributing products as of use value rather than exchange value. This changed in 1928, however, through the economic buildup of the USSR, bringing back commodity production and generalizing it. Restoration of small and medium-sized private industry working on a capitalist basis under a loose state supervision. If industry in this instance is made for producing products and use value rather than exchange value, but planning distribution under the supervision of the state, controlled by the workers themselves as of mass, and having a full say into production and distribution, then how is it private on a capitalist basis and loose state supervision? This claim is statistically and historically inaccurate. It's clear Caelliox has not done much research or thinking prior to writing this. A limited reopening of the Soviet economy to foreign investments by offering concessions and highly profitable basis for investors in raw materials and extraction of industry. This is only the case that at 1930, at the earliest, none of this happened under the NEP. They made sure to suppress foreign capital's influence as hard as possible, while retaining for the workers, and banks. And banks only had the role of management for materials and unused under the supervision of workers, and actually abolish investment for these in the process. How do you have an investment for a product produced for the reason of not being invested in? In other words, how the hell do you quantify something that's inherently quantitative? In other words, again, if you're not following, how do you put something for use value while being exchanged at the same time? The answer is you can't. And if you really say so, then you might as well call yourself Shane Killen, because that's exactly what he thinks can happen. Although it's impossible, because it would have already negated the means of exchangement if it was based on use value. The reorganization of the nationalized large-scale mass market industries, placing these two into a large extent on a capitalist footing under direct supervision and control of the proletarian state. If this was real, then how could you call it a workers' state if there is still a capitalist footing, when the workers' state is by practicality is the opposite of capitalism? The workers' state is the revolution itself on the ongoing abolition of classes and money by abolishing the market and other capitalist footings, as we pointed out again through the things that they abolished and the things that they implemented. It would have been impossible for this unless if you think that they were making actual economic changes in the period of war communism, then they were still fighting in revolution in their own country. In this period, Russia had more economic foundation for state capitalism, which was a step forward, than it had for socialism. The main goal of the NEP was to create the foundations of necessary building of a socialist economy. In 1923, explained that is the more matter of years before this process would be completed. He proceeds to take an out of context quote from the speech at the plenary session of the Moscow Soviet by Vladimir Lenin. He is referring to these last words in the speech of the plenary session of the Moscow Soviet by Vladimir Lenin. Socialism is no longer a matter of distant future, an abstract picture, or an icon, or our opinion of icons is the same, a very bad one. We have brought socialism into everyday life, and must here see the matters stand in the task of our day and the task of our epoch. Permit me to conclude expressing confidence that difficult the task may be, new as it may, compared to the previous tasks, and numerous as the difficulties may be that it entails. We shall all, not in day, but in few years, all of us together fulfill whatever the cost, so the NEP will become Socialist Russia. Vladimir Lenin, speech at the plenary of the Moscow Soviet. This is implied as something that is not the actual implication, and once again, like what we said before on the slogan of the United States of Europe, this quote and its idea is based on slogan and tendency, not of economics. Case in point, the task we have set ourselves, our party, a little group of people in comparison with the country's total population, has tackled this job. This tiny nucleus has set itself the task of remaking everything, and will do so. I have proved this is no utopia, but a cause which people live by. We have seen all this. This has already been done. We must remake things in such a way where the great majority of the masses, the peasants, the workers, will say, it is not you who praise yourself, but we. We'd say that you have achieved the splendid results after which no intelligent person will ever dream of returning to the old. We have not reached that point yet. That's why the new economic policy remains in the main current and all-embracing slogan of today. We shall not forget the single of the slogans we learned yesterday, and we can say that quite calmly, without the slightest inhibition. Say it to anybody. Every step that demonstrates it. But we still have to adapt ourselves to the new economic policy. We must know how to overcome, to reduce the definite minimum of the negative features, and there is no need to ameliorate it, and which you know perfectly well. We must know unto the range and everything shrewdly. Our legislation gives us every opportunity to do so. Shall we be able to get things going properly? That is still far from being settled. We are making study of things. Every issue of our party newspaper offers a dozen articles which tell you to the such and such a factory owned by and so, and a written tale of the terms are such and such, whereas not another where our communist comrade is the manager of the terms are such and such. Does it yield for profit or not? Does it play its way or not? We have approached at the very core of the everyday problems that is a tremendous achievement. Socialism is no longer a mere matter of distant future or an abstract picture or an icon. Our opinion, our icons are the same or a very bad one. We have brought socialism into everyday life and must here see how matters stand. This is the task of our day and the task of our epoch. Permit me to conclude the expressing confidence of the difficult of the task. May be new as the new compared previous task and the numerous difficulties may entails that we shall not in day, but in a few years, all of us together fulfill it, whatever the cost, so that the NEP will become Socialist Russia. Vladimir Lenin's speech at the plenary session of the Moscow Soviet. Pay attention where he says, "We have not reached that point yet." That is why NEP remains the main current and all-embracing slogan of today. We shall not forget the single one of the slogans we learned yesterday. We can say, and quite calmly, without the slightest hesitation to say to anybody, it's a step demonstrates it, but we still have to adopt ourselves to the new economic policy. This is very clear from Vladimir Lenin that he is referring to the slogan and socialism as if it was a tendency, and was looking at hope of the future of socialist revolution. This would be incorrect in hindsight, unfortunately, however. But the point is, I think we should point to Caelliox. He keeps trying to fetishize this. We define an economic situation based on its economic activity. We define systems based on its economic activity. And most importantly, we always have to look at things in its totality to get the full picture. An opposition group in the Moscow City Committee, headed Alexei Rekov and Viktor Nugin, opposed onto the basis of Lenin's thesis and the grounds that Russia was too industrially underdeveloped for socialist construction. In response to this, Lenin replied with, he proceeds to take a possibly non-existing quote that I could not find. Clear enough, I think. As the thing says, the quote provided that is supposedly from Vladimir Lenin I could not find, and from my understanding thus leaves the legitimacy of this quote unknown. Now, obviously, as I said before, this quote is something I cannot find and really look at, and thus its legitimacy is unknown. But even if this quote was real and from Vladimir Lenin, which is unknown, I really don't understand what this has to do with the analysis of the new economic policy. The only way where this quote could have any relevance is if the claim is the fact that a revolution can be good alone in an underdeveloped country, which with not much power in the world market. Which, knowing you probably would make that claim. But that's a different discussion, which I can leave you quotes from Lenin, but then again, the legitimacy of this quote is unknown, so I would probably constitute as something, I wouldn't constitute it as something solid. Speaking of which, Caelliox, if you're watching this, or for anyone that had contact with Caelliox, please tell him where he quote where he quotes people that he really needs to source where he's getting it from, because of the following reasons. One, it saves you from a reputation of possibly faking quotes. Two, it's way easier for my situation at this moment. Three, it provides honesty. Four, it provides context. Five, it gives for everyone for a better understanding. Six, it will encourage people to read more theory. Seven, it leaves more informative analysis. And eight, it's more effective on presenting a point and public written filmed work. Yeah, I think that's probably gonna be it, everybody. Yeah. Thank you for watching this video. Yep, it's an hour and 9 minutes and stuff. So yeah. Hope you enjoyed this video. Like I said, this is definitely going to be like a multiple part series, it seems. And yeah. Let's see. Like I said, I have a Discord now, so you guys can join there. And if you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button. I would very much appreciate it. And you can probably see the content I make. Usually. If you like this video, hit the like button, so that way we can probably get this message and get entirely of our messages and our entire videos out there entirely to the masses, or to, I guess, other people on YouTube. So yeah. And sources and will be in the description down below, and as well as the article that I responded to will also be in the description down below, as well as the authors, or at least the authors education project's Twitter. Actually no, yeah, actually just YouTube channel. Yeah, no, they don't even have a Twitter, that's right. But yeah, no, thank you for watching this video, and yeah, have a good one. Oh shoot, yep, have a good one.